Good evening. It is absolutely a pleasure for us to really get on to the next conversation for our Thinkers Dialogue. And today we have a very special guest who's joined us from US. In fact, our special guest today is William Novelli. Of course, he is a professor at the Georgetown Business School, or what you would call as the McDonough School of Business at Georgetown University. But before that, he has an exceptional career in the world of, or in the corporate world. He started what you would call as Porto Novelli, and became one of the most famous enterprises in the country. He's done that, but coming back to academics, he's done something very exceptional, and that is that he's created some. Of course, he's written some books, but the most important thing was something called as the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. I must share that it was many years back, I think 4 to 5 years back, when Bill and I actually met over a lunch in DC, and then he started talking about transformation and transform advanced care. And that is where we got into the genesis of what we would call as the ease of quality of life for the elderly. And that conversation became the starting point for my body of work on quality of life. Incidentally, we just launched the Index on Quality of Life for Elderly today morning with the Economic Advisory Council, the Prime Minister, and Dr. Vivek Debroy was there. But what I really want to say is that it was a conversation with him which started it. So thanks, Bill, for that. And then, of course, but quite interestingly, he's been one of the biggest protagonists of what you would call as anti-tobacco, and how we need to really improve the lives by actually making people understand that tobacco is bad and so on and so forth. So he created something called as Tobacco Free Kids. He still chairs it, but but with a long distant relationship now, because he spends full time at the business school. And then, of course, he recently wrote a book called Good Business. And that is what we are really going to focus our conversation on. In fact, I think I can spend the next 30 minutes talking about him. But I think it's time that we get into a conversation and really understand what the whole idea of good business is. Bill, thanks a lot for joining in. It's an absolute honor to have you with us.
Ahmed, it's great to be here. It's great to see you again, and I'm really pleased to be part of your program.
Thank you, Bill. So, in fact, let me ask you a very interesting question here. Like your book, something called as Good Business. I really want to ask you, and the title is very interesting: The Talk, Fight, Win Way to Change the World. And I find it to be a very interesting title. So first, I have to ask you a question: why did you choose this title? But then, most importantly, what inspired you to write this book?
Well, I was inspired to write the book because I felt that the business model, the business world, and I don't just mean the U.S., I mean very broadly, globally, the business model is changing. And I think there are more and more companies moving along a continuum towards what I call doing well by doing good. So there are many terms of art. People talk about ESG, they talk about shared value, sustainability. And the label I give to it is doing well by doing good. And in the book, I talk about different companies that are moving along this continuum. And the continuum basically is figuring out that they can create social value for all of us, for all of their stakeholders, and at the same time, create economic value for their stockholders. So it's a win-win situation. And there are many good examples of this. So that's what good business is about, moving along that continuum to create economic value and social value.
This is very interesting because you of course, really brought in the whole aspect of ESG, shared value. There are so many schools of thought or many ideas that are going there. And of course, like if you really talk about ESG, let me ask you a very nasty question. And don't you think ESG is a fad than anything else?
Well, that fads happen, right? We both know this. You'll see a trend and then that trend will disappear. I think that this is going to be, if not permanent, at least very long lasting. So for a long, long time, decades, corporations operated on the idea that Their only responsibility was to create uh, profit. And I think that what we see now is that capitalism, just based on profit, is not working so well. And that we need to take into account all stakeholders. And there are many advantages to this. You get a competitive advantage out of it. Employee engagement, more and more employees, especially younger employees, they want to see purpose as well as a paycheck. So employees are very expensive to recruit and to retain, and companies are figuring out that they need to create purpose to keep those employees. Um, and then investor relations. Look at investors today. More and more of them are becoming activists, and they're demanding ESG. And then the idea of a license to operate. The idea that if you're going to be operating, you better behave. You better be a good corporate citizen. And I'll give you a quick example of that. We just finished a study for AB InBev, the giant brewing company, and they are working. They put $1 billion into responsible drinking around the world because they know that they just can't sell beer. They have to sell responsible drinking as well as consumption. So there's an example of if you want to operate, if you want a license to operate, you've got to take on responsibility.
So, like, Bill, this is very powerful as an idea, and then like taking responsibility. And I think you're also hinting at that how capitalism is changing. But of course, if you really just taking a step back onto this idea of when you're talking about capitalism, uh, don't you think within the US and many parts of the world, we have seen some nasty effects of how capitalism has moved, like the rising disparity that we have actually seen and things, and the impact it actually has on politics of various countries. Where does your model fit in? Because I think what you're already saying is something very, very smart, very impactful. How does your model fit in to really solve the challenges, problems that we face?
Yeah. Well, I think the word nasty fits. We have a lot of problems in the world, in our country, in India, everywhere. And many of those problems, I think, are problems created by, or at least fostered by, a capitalist approach. And so if you look in the US, the biggest organization in the US for big corporations is the Business Roundtable. And just 2 years ago, the Business Roundtable came out and they said, we've got to get away from this model of the business of business is business. We've got to move forward. We've got to take all stakeholders into account. So when these major companies and their CEOs say this, you can see that they're beginning to figure it out, that they're changing that economic model. Take a giant company like Unilever, where I started my career. I mean, Unilever is worldwide, and they have made this concept into an advantage, a corporate advantage for that company. So it's not, and I'm not pretending that all companies are doing this. Many of them don't care. Many of them are not figuring it out, but more and more are moving along that line.
Well, again, just moving on to this thing. So the way companies are changing. The other thing is that you also said purpose is becoming a very important factor. So the question that I have is, how do you define good business? And once you say good business, because what I hear you saying is good business and purpose, that there is a huge interlinkage that possibly happens.
Yeah, purpose is the foundation of the idea of doing well by doing good. So an example, I think, is the VF Corporation. Lots of people don't know the VF Corporation, but they have these big brands like the North Face, Vans, Timberland, and they have probably 1 million employees working for contract employers. In other words, these are women around the world, but 80% women, 85% women. So they're working in factories. They're producing apparel and footwear for these big VF brands, and VF handles the supply chain. So VF says, okay, we've got to focus on purpose. And what they do is they survey these women. Now, these women are not their direct employees. They're working for contractors in big factories. And they ask these women, what do you need? And the women will say, well, we need childcare, we need clean water, we need eyeglasses, we need some protection from sexual harassment at work. And then VF tries to provide that through NGOs on the ground, through UNICEF, through other means. And they do this, A, because they think it's the right thing to do. They've got this idea of altruism. B, it improves productivity. But C, the young consumers, millennials, Gen Z, the younger consumers, they insist on knowing that the people who produce the products they buy are being treated fairly. So there are many reasons for taking on this purpose on the part of VF. It's both a profit motive and it is a social motive.
So, Bill, just taking this a step forward. So when you say purpose, of course, there has to be a social motive, a profit motive.
Yes.
Youngsters are liking it. There is a huge transformational impact. But you will also end up seeing firms which are fairly exploitative or can be called exploitative. It's a question of perspective, that they would extract the maximum value across the value chain, but the farmers who are producing it or people who are making it will not get the level of money that they could have got. And I'm coming from a very interesting example here. We have a firm called Mother Dairy in India, or Amul, who are milk distributors or their cooperative systems, but 83% of their money goes back to the farmers, and they run their business in 17%. But that is quite unlike most of the other models that we might find across the world.
Yeah, I think you got a good example. There are many companies that are exploitive. They will extract minerals, oil, whatever, and not give back, not be fair. Um, a good example, I think, is the fossil fuel industry. Now, here you have oil and gas around the world. We have a planet that's in danger. Climate change is affecting all of us. So these companies have got to figure out what to do. Governments are after them. These are huge, major companies, and they see the writing on the wall. Why is this happening? It's happening not just because we have these environmental disasters in front of us, but they're being attacked. They're being attacked by government. They're being attacked by investors. My own university is divesting its investments in fossil fuels. And so there's a lot of pressure on companies to change. And I agree with you. There are many companies that are not getting the message, but change is coming. Change is happening. So that's the good business part. The talk, fight, win part is that these huge environmental and social issues are way too big for endless combat. We've got to get everybody at the table. You mentioned tobacco. The Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, for a long time negotiated with the tobacco industry. We had to do that to drive down smoking, not just in the US, but today in low and middle income countries. Fossil fuel industry, we got to get them to the table. We're not always going to agree. And Tuesday's enemies could be Thursday's allies. And the idea of everybody at the table talk and fight to win is what I try to talk about in the book.
And when you come to tobacco, and that's something very interesting, and I have to talk about that. So, uh, tobacco is like something which gets consumed by tons and tons of people. I think in the Indian context, the number could be anything between 250 to 300 million people who are actually consuming tobacco. I think, in spite of higher taxation and that the government levies, it seems to be a very difficult nut to crack. Governments typically cannot remove tobacco from the system because actually it gives you large sets of revenues. And then, of course, you have consumers who seemingly find it to be enjoyable, which I fail to understand as to what's enjoyable in that. But then I've tried smoking, and I can tell you that I've just not understood as to what makes the difference there. So how do you really look at this?
Well, the thing about tobacco that makes it almost unique is that nicotine is addictive. And in our country, and I think in most countries, most smokers begin before the age of 18 or before the age of 21. And so, as you say, governments can't just ban tobacco. First of all, they have tax revenues coming in. And secondly, if you just ban the product, you would probably create a huge black market. And so now what we have to do is we have to deal with it as a product in our marketplace. And the way to do it is increase taxes, because when the price goes up, what happens is smoking goes down, especially among children, because as a product becomes more expensive, it takes it out of their economic reach for the most part. Secondly, we've got to help adults to quit. The average adult probably does want to quit, but is really addicted, and it takes 4, 5, 6 times of trying to be able to quit. So governments, nonprofits, others have to basically help adults to quit, and that is working.
Mhm.
We have to help kids not to become addicted,
So,
and that's an important thing to do. So it's a combination of strategies, and many countries around the world are engaging in this. India is one of them. Look at countries like China, where they realize that they've got smokers. They're losing, 400 in the United States. 450,000 people a year die from tobacco-related disease. You can't have that. You need strategies. You need public strategies, social strategies, and that's what we're engaged in.
so I have to come back to this point, but I really wanted you to answer this question because the next thing that I really wanted to ask you was about the whole idea of social marketing, because that's where I was really wanting to take you to. And like, of course, you created this firm called Porter Novelli, and that's a time when the whole idea of social marketing was very new. It was just probably very nascent at that point in time. We were not really appreciating as to what is happening. Uh, what did you find that was compelling, and how has the role of social marketing changed over time? And then, of course, there is this tobacco example that you talked about. So, could you just give us that journey across this example, if possible?
Yeah, yeah. Well, it was indeed a journey. So I started my career at Unilever in marketing. And then I went to a big ad agency, a big hot ad agency in New York. And in both cases, I was working on packaged goods, detergents, fabric softeners, kids' cereals, pet food. And in all those cases, I was doing well. I was climbing the corporate ladder, but I was not happy. And I was not happy because I just couldn't see social value in all that work. And then I got lucky. The ad agency assigned me a client, public television. And it was the first time they had hired an ad agency to try to build audience. So I went to this press conference, and this woman said, I'm here to tell you that we're going to revolutionize children's education on TV. And she was introducing Sesame Street. And I was listening to her and I was saying, she's an educator, but she's also a marketing person. And this light bulb went on in my head. And what I thought was, you could take the marketing skills that I was using on kids' cereal or detergents and apply them to social issues and causes. And so I began to think that way, and I created a career out of it. And as you say, when we started Porto Novelli, it was a relatively new concept. So we basically pioneered in the idea of social marketing. Today, Porto Novelli is a big international, it's a global PR agency, but it still has that sense of purpose. So the first client we had, Amit, was the National High Blood Pressure Education Program. And the idea was, how can you lower blood pressure on a broad national basis? And I learned a couple of important lessons there. One was the idea of partnerships, everybody at the table. So these big pharmaceutical companies would join the program. And they joined the program essentially because they realized that the better job we did of convincing people to get their blood pressure checked and to take their medicine and so forth, the more product they sold. So they were doing well by doing good way back then. And the second big lesson I learned was you can't just take your marketing mix, the idea of product and distribution and price and so forth. You just can't work that on individual behaviors. You need to work at a big environmental level as well. You need to change normative behavior at the environmental level. And the basic way to do that is through policy. policy advocacy. So I incorporated that into the social marketing mix. And if you can do that, what you've got is a very powerful way to intervene, to make change happen.
So like this is again very interesting. So policy advocacy, how do you really create partnerships, changing the normative behavior? But I have to get you back. In fact, you have compelled me to ask you a question in
Okay.
today's parlance. Like like where we are sitting today is a crisis of or of magnitude that we have not seen in the last 100 years or 150 years. So the whole crisis that we see because of COVID, and there is this whole thing of, say, vaccine hesitancy. And what you're really saying is so interesting in terms of how do you really create that behavioral change? Like at one end, science says that, yes, this is something great. Please go take a vaccine. And there is this vaccine hesitancy that happens. And it's not just the United States, it's happening across the world. And it is being done by educated people, not that they were the uneducated people who were saying, I'm not going to get a vaccine.
Yeah. Well, I would, I'll say something perhaps controversial. To me, that's a marketing problem. No, most governments have not done a good job with COVID. But when you come to vaccine hesitancy, all these people who are hesitant or resistant are not the same. So in the US, there are probably 4 or 5 different segments, and you can't treat them all the same. Some of them are hesitant because they really don't understand or they don't have access. They're afraid to take time off from work. So that's one segment. Another segment, and I have a friend who's in this segment, these are people who are anti-government. And they say, I'm not going to get a vaccination. I refuse to become a government slave. That kind of attitude. We also have, among many African Americans in our country, hesitancy because they have been mistreated in our health system for many years. And so they're hesitant for that reason. And so what you need to do is you need to do really good segmentation research and then appeal to each segment on the basis of what they believe. That's what we have to do. And I think that's true probably across the world. And so, it's a bit cheeky to say this, but it's a marketing issue.
That's fascinating because if you're just not really creating the right communication, then that's where the whole challenge happens. Let's take this whole conversation forward. Like there is this very unique report or a very startling report or very, I would rather say, a report which really creates a lot of havoc in my mind as the UN report on climate that just happened in the last 48 hours. It says that we, as humanity, we have possibly reached a point of no return. We are in a crisis of sorts, which is huge. We have to really work now to really save the planet, save the species. So, where do you think social marketing fits in addressing this huge social and environmental problem that we face, which is just hit right on the face? Until about 6 months back, we were still arguing, oh, this is not real. You had a president who was going ballistic in terms of saying that, oh, this is just all bullshit or all crap. I'm sorry for saying it. But, but here we are with a unique report, which just, what do you call, wax the head out of whatever. So over to you, Bill.
Well, I consider the issue of climate change the biggest problem that we face as human beings across the world. There are many, many problems that each of our countries have, but this one is the biggest. This is truly existential. And if we don't tackle this, we're going to have a burning planet. I'm sitting here in Montana in the US, and there are forest fires everywhere. There's this heat dome over the northwestern United States. This is just one example. This is happening everywhere. And so it brings us back to where I was before. We've got to do something. The UN is trying to lead the way, but every country has got to step up. And the United States, unfortunately, lags behind. We lag behind because our politicians have not tackled it. So it's a combination, if you will, of getting the public to act and creating policy changes. And time is running out, as you said. We don't have a lot of time to tackle this. So I've been working on it. I've been working on it in several ways. but we all have to step up. There is no bigger problem that we have.
So how do you think that, of course, as academic, you're really appreciative of whatever is happening. There are some individuals, or what you would call as activists. A lot of countries will call them activists, who are onto it, or who believe that this is something very, very important for us to look at. How do you convince the governments, the corporations, to really start thinking about it and saying that this is about good business? This is about social and what you would call as, say, social value and economic value, as you said in the beginning. How do you really
Yes.
put it into their minds?
Well, of course, it's very difficult depending on where they are. As I said, it is a continuum. But I think it takes us back to what we were talking about before. We need policy change. We need governments to say, we're going to do something about this climate crisis. And we're going to reduce our fossil fuel consumption. We're going to put less fossil fuels into the air. All these big government steps that need to be taken. And these are steps that for the most part, are expensive. So the way I think about it, Amit, is we've got to work top down and bottom up. We've got to put pressure on governments to change, and we see that in many countries now. But we've got to work bottom up as well. If the public doesn't believe this, if the public doesn't take action, if the public doesn't support government change, then we're not going to succeed. So we need to work both ends of the issue at the same time. And one of the most powerful things that I've come across, and I did this in tobacco and in many other areas, is youth advocacy. The youth of the world are seeing this more clearly than the adults. And when we see, and these kids are fearless. They'll lobby anybody, a prime minister, a congressman, anybody, you name it. And if we can get them not just to be excited about the idea, but to take action, that's an important strategy.
Hmm. And that's moving ahead, so when you really talk about involving the youth and everything, but then just taking a step forward here, uh, you talk about, and of course, in many of your writings, about the idea of, say, triple bottom line. And uh, how would you really look at this whole idea of people, planet, profit, uh, in, in the whole book of good business, or what you're really talking of? And how should companies think about the triple bottom line? Should each of these ideas be given equal weight, or whatever? Because I know, like, from my point of view, planet has to be number one, because if we don't survive, everything else is all going to go waste. But what's your view on this?
Well, I share your view. People, planet, profit is another way of talking about doing well by doing good. And it varies by company. Companies have an obligation to make a profit. So that needs to be part of the formula. But as you say, today, planet has to take precedence. Every company has to do this. They don't necessarily have to change their business model if they're selling soap or if they're selling toothpaste. But what they have to do is they have to make sure that they themselves, as a company, take action to reduce their carbon footprint. There are many examples of companies that are not yet doing this. Their employees have to put pressure on. Government policy has to be brought to bear. Youth advocacy, all these different strategies. But as you say, right now, with all the problems we have, planet has to come first.
Okay. And so, how do you think the pandemic has affected us right now, especially on people, or on the triple bottom line idea?
Well, nobody knows. What we talk about the new normal. I've been working from home for the most part for, I don't know, a year and a half. I'll be going back to work when I return to Washington. What will it be like? Will I go into the office every day as I used to, or will I go in 3 days? We don't know how the pandemic is going to affect the future of business or the future of society. But what we do know is we have to get it under control. We're not going to be economically sound. Right now, it's not under control in your country, in my country. It's not under control in Africa. The EU is wrestling with it. And a lot of this goes back to the fact that that countries, governments are short-sighted. I talk in the book about prevention, preparedness. Countries have not prepared for this, and yet there's going to be another pandemic for sure. 5 years from now, 10 years from now, who knows when? And why are governments like this? It's because we're short-sighted as a people, as humans. We have a disaster and then we forget about it. Governments say, well, we can't spend all this money on prevention. But of course, that's the most efficient way to deal with big problems. And that's why we need policy. That's why we need to work on policy and policy change and put pressure on governments.
So, Bill, if I want to push you back on this, it seems like quite a lot of times you're just saying that government will have to do it. Like, why is it we can't say that corporations should be the drivers here? Governments will create the ecosystem or the basic regulatory structure, and enterprises should do it because they create profits, they create wealth, and the government creates a regulatory frame.
Yeah, believe me, I don't excuse companies. I believe, and I write in the book, and we talk about in our Business for Impact program at Georgetown, companies can be a powerful force for good. And more companies are stepping up. If you look at international development, bilateral aid to countries is never going to get us to a point where we have true development. It's companies that are going to make the difference. And so I'm with you all the way. I'm a capitalist, but I think of myself as a capitalist in a new model. This new model, the idea of corporate purpose, and profit is part of it.
So, Bill, there has been a general thinking that NGOs don't really fulfill any role in the world, or they can always be that criticism. They should be thrown out, or they're ineffective, they're political animals, or they create more problems than solving them. But when I see a person like you moved from corporate to the nonprofit world. You've created some very amazing organizations. What was your thinking on that? And then my next question allied to this is, do you think not-for-profits do really make a difference?
Oh, I definitely think they make a difference. I think NGOs are important, but we've learned very clearly that they can't do it alone. We've got in essence three sectors. We've got civil society, so that's nonprofits and universities and religious institutions and so forth. We've got the private sector, the companies that we've been talking about, and we've got government. And those three sectors, if we can get them to operate together, then we have a powerful force for change. And that's why we need everybody at the table. No sector can be responsible for everything. No sector is big enough to solve these problems on its own. We need to develop this harmonious approach. And of course, that's very, very hard to do. And that's why we need everybody at the table. So an example right now is we have this program at Georgetown that we oversee, that we built and that we run. And it's a coalition of food and beverage companies, of nonprofits, of academics, and of government. And it's about combating obesity and overweight. And I can tell you that these organizations don't agree. A fast food company doesn't agree with a NGO watchdog. But if we can get everybody at the table, if we can talk and fight, we can win.
So how do you bring everybody on the table? Is a big
it's
question.
Hard. It's very hard.
That's the biggest challenge. You've been working in areas which I find to be very, very unique, difficult at points in time. It's something like this. Like when you talk about tobacco, again, very difficult space from my point of view. 300 million people in India having it. Probably, I think 20% of the world is consuming tobacco in some form or the other. How do you really work on that? The second thing is and suddenly you talk about obesity. And I think half the world is becoming obese right now. And what you're really talking about is to probably stop having sugar, to stop having what do you call, oil-based food and so on and so forth. Uh, how do you
Yeah.
really make people understand all this?
Well, it's very hard to do. Of course, it's hard to do. And I can tell you, I've made many mistakes in my life trying to build partnerships. But if you look just for a second at obesity as an example, we need companies, of course. They need to reformulate their products, as you just said, in terms of sugar and salt and so forth. We need restaurants to step up. In the U.S., many restaurants compete on volume. You go in and they'll say you get more for your money here. A $20 dinner buys you more than the restaurant next door. Well, volume is not the way to reduce obesity and overweight. So we need to give restaurants the right message and show them that they can make profit by rebalancing their meals. And then the hardest part is the consumer. And so what you need to do is figure out how to get all three of these strategies to work together. And the one thing I can tell you is, it's not, first of all, it's not easy, but secondly, it's not quick. None of these big social problems can be solved overnight. And that's why global warming is such a crisis. We don't have a lot of time. A big oil and gas company, ExxonMobil. I used to have an executive from ExxonMobil come in and speak to my MBA students. And he always laid out a chart. And in this chart, he would show fossil fuels and the importance they play in global energy. And he would show how they would diminish over time. And in 50 years, we'd be using a lot less gasoline, oil than we do now. And the students would always challenge him. And they'd say, why 50 years? Why not tomorrow? Why are you taking so long? And he'd say, you can't run a modern economy without fossil fuels. And the sooner we get to electric cars, the sooner we get to this, the sooner we get to that, the better. But we're not there yet. So they're very complex problems. And what we have to do is we have to accelerate that process.
Well, like I have to ask you a pointed question here, and you made a very remarkable point that companies should work on reformulating their products, right? And probably they have to change. Restaurants can change their menus and things, or when you talk about food companies like Nestle's or the Unilevers of the world, they can change the composition or the structure or whatever you call about the product, or what are the ingredients. My question arises from a very interesting fact, and somehow I've not been able to find a good answer to this. And that is that when you talk about these large enterprises, which who make some amazing quality of products in the Western world, and when I say Western, it means the developed world, they bring a product to India, which is possibly not of a similar quality, or it has they have a different composition, something like an ice cream. Uh, Ice cream is supposed to be made of milk. The large enterprise, the multinational, would actually make the product out of milk in the developed world. But when it actually gets it to India, it puts palm oil. And we all know that the ingredient is not good for health. If anything which is consumed in larger quantities, it is just not good for health. How do you tell companies that this is something that you don't have to do? It is not only about profits; it's about something else. And this is a debate that's been happening for years in India, and still we are just sitting here. I've been looking at it for the last 20 years. In fact, I must share an interesting story here. I did talk about one of the companies in one of my sessions at a school here in India, and they just went ballistic against me that how do you say that a product is wrong or whatever. But then that's a separate issue. Over to you, Bill.
Yeah, well, I consider that a bad strategy on the part of the companies to do that. It's a bad. It might bring them more profit in the short term, and maybe they see that as a way to make money, but it's not socially responsible. In a developed country, they have a lot of pressure to change their products. And it's consumer pressure, it's government pressure, whatever. And so, Amit, what they do oftentimes is they reformulate, but they don't tell the consumer. They don't say to the consumer, we've taken more salt out of this product. And they don't do that because the consumer says, well, I'm not getting my money's worth, or it doesn't taste as good. So they make the reformulation, and they don't tell the consumer, and we call that stealth health. But they're making the product more nutritious or more healthy. In India, when they do the kind of thing you're talking about and substitute palm oil for milk or whatever, the average consumer doesn't understand that. It's a question of taste, and so it's very hard to get the consumers to react. There, you have to, I think, go other ways. You have to, get consumers to get consumers educated so that they can actively oppose the product. You got to get other companies to say, hey, our product is better and here's why. But here again, I go back to policy. If you want to sell your product in our company, in our country, you have got to be a good corporate citizen. And so it's all three sectors working together or putting pressure on through all three sectors.
Well,
And
don't
it's
you
not
think?
easy. It's not easy.
But don't you think you're missing a very important point here? And that is that corporations, with their power of money, with their power of what I would call as PR or public relations, can actually influence policy far more than anybody else. Uh, of course, I do agree with your point that government should really create policy, regulation, whatever. I think there is no second thoughts on it, but corporations can effectively work on it. In fact, just as an example, is something that has happened in California, that there were these ride-hailing services which spent close to about $200 million to on PR and to really prove that all these drivers are entrepreneurs rather than actually employees. So these kind of things happen, and how do you really look at this?
Well, you need to fight back. That example that you give is a really good example. The so-called gig economy, all these workers who are working for low wages. Now, we studied this at Georgetown, and here again, you have different segments. Older gig workers tend to be relatively satisfied with what they have, whether they're Uber drivers or they're working in some other way. Younger gig workers are not happy for the most part. They're doing this because they haven't found something else. And what we need to do is we need to figure out two things. One is how to help them, how to offer them insurance, how to offer them other kinds of services that they need, other kinds of products that they need, and how to get companies at the same time to treat their workers fairly. Now, let's go back to the VF Corporation that I was talking about earlier. They're selling all these products in Europe, in the United States, and so forth. And what if we told consumers that they were not treating their employees fairly? That would have a real effect in the Western world. And so we need to be able to say to these companies, do the right thing, or we're going to advocate against you. And at the same time, we need the companies at the table to see that there's advantage in doing the right thing. Now, I'm not saying this is altruism. This is not about going to heaven. This is about making money. And they can make more money by doing the right thing than by trying to exploit a country or a population.
Got it. But Bill, just moving ahead onto this, you also make a very important point, and that is uh, you have to affect policy. And how do you really work with governments to affect policy? Because that's something very important. Like, one is, of course, advocacy, writing studies, probably writing articles. What more can be done to really bring this change? And that's what you really have been doing all your life, and you talk
Yeah,
about it all the time.
yeah. Well, papers and policy studies and so forth, they're all important. But one of the most important strategies is advocacy. So here's an example. When it comes to climate change, I've been working with an organization called the Medical Society Consortium on Climate and Health. So these are about 30 medical societies, the American Medical Association, all these, pediatrics, obstetrics, all these different medical societies. They're all working together to advocate for climate action because they think of it as a health crisis. And so they lobby the government They educate individual physicians to talk to their patients at the local level, and they do everything in between. So there's an example of finding an organization or creating an organization for which this is their self-interest. This, for them, this is important so that they can keep their patients healthy. So that's an example of I call it strange bedfellows. Your best partners may not be the people you think of at first. If you're an oil and gas company, maybe you ought to turn to youth and say, what can we do better? Can you advocate in our behalf if we can make change? So strange bedfellows. Be creative.
So I have to ask you a naughty question then at this point in time. And the naughty question is that, like when you talk about strange bedfellows and things, you had, as I was reading about tobacco-free kids and the work that you've done, and of course there is this very unique product. I would rather not say that they call this vape not burn products or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And I'm sorry, I'm forgetting the name. I think the product is called a Joule or a not. I think it's called ICOS.
Yes.
Yeah. So and they're trying to say that it's a technologically superior product. Let it go. Do you think that could be a strange bedfellow example to really say, let's converge with them, change technologically? Just a naughty question here. You can avoid answering this if you want to.
No. The tobacco industry never gives up. You can never let down your guard when you're dealing with the tobacco industry. So in many countries, they're continuing to do the same things they did, in Europe or the US 25 years ago. Free samples, concerts, attracting women to smoke, attracting kids to smoke. Now they've got this new technology. They call it heat, don't burn. And the idea is that you can get the flavor of a cigarette, the nicotine pleasure of a cigarette, with fewer of the carcinogens. This is a wonderful new product. Well, of course, the science is not in on how safe this product is. It's going to take years to do the research on it. And so what I say is we should be opposing heat don't burn, just like we oppose combustible cigarettes. We should be opposing vaping because vaping is a nicotine-based product. And it's bad for the adolescent brain, and it addicts kids potentially into becoming smokers as adults. So every time a company comes up with a new technology, the answer is, how good is it? And if it's not any good, then we have to oppose it. You can never let down your guard.
Well, I fundamentally agree with you, because if you just do that, and then I think it can just, if somebody just says that this technology is good, you could just see a spike in consumption. I
Right.
wonder that might actually happen, because
That's
it's
right.
bound to happen. But then
Well,
I also find something very interesting. There seems to be that FDA has approved this product. Sorry, correct me if I'm wrong, but there seems to be some FDA thing. And I find it to be a very strong thing from a good business perspective. How do you tell these tobacco companies? My question is this exactly: to transform their businesses into something else, but they're so large, it might actually be difficult for them to transform.
well, sure, it's difficult, and they're trying, of course, to stay in business. If people stopped smoking tomorrow, they'd be out of business. So they come up with new technologies, vaping, heat don't burn. They keep adding different flavors that attract children, watermelon and strawberry and all this business. And you've got to be aggressive. So in our country, the Food and Drug Administration approves these products. And right now, the Campaign for Tobacco-Free Kids, the American Cancer Society, the American Heart Association, they are suing the Food and Drug Administration.
Okay.
And they're suing the FDA because the FDA is not acting fast enough to get rid of these flavored products and to get rid of other products that are deemed unhealthful. So it's a question of multiple strategies. No single strategy is going to work.
So, Bill, like just moving ahead on this, we just don't want to stay around tobacco or whatever, but that's an area that excites me. And as you know, like I've worked with TFK,
Right.
doing some work, but then that's where it is. And I believe in exactly what you're doing, I must admit. And But then coming back to this work that you're doing, you have founded something like uh, an impact initiative at the university, or what you call as the Georgetown Business for Impact Initiative. Uh, why did you do that? Is it something which is related to your idea of bringing corporates and nonprofit world together? Is it about creating those partnerships? What is it all about? What is this animal
That's
about?
that's exactly what it's about. So what I'm trying to do at Georgetown is exactly what we're talking about. So we have this program, Business for Impact. It's in the business school, but we attract students from all over the university. And we do essentially three things on it. Number one, we do these partnerships that we're talking about. A partnership with AB InBev, with Bank of America, with VF Corporation, and so forth. And these partnerships are predicated on the idea of the triple bottom line: people, planet, profit. The second thing we do is we try to give the students a superior experience in the classroom and also on an extracurricular basis. So we have probably 170 students involved with us right now. They're doing internships, they're doing work with companies, they're doing research and analysis. And these are the students who, one of the students said to me, I have a lot of student debt and I need to pay that off. I want to have a family. I want to have a career. I want to have a good job, but I never want to lose my sense of purpose. And those are the kinds of students we attract. And then the third thing we do is what we think of as sharing knowledge and thought leadership, like the book that we're talking about, the Good Business Book, and other studies and research and so forth. So for us, we serve as a magnet for students and prospective students who want to come to Georgetown to be part of this. And we're not the only university, other universities are doing this. I see this as a powerful way to improve, to advance social progress.
And, but Bill, I have to ask you this question then. When you talk about, say, the idea of good business, you've also said that there is something called, say, shared value that you're talking about. You have conscious capitalism. You have BOP, or bottom of the pyramid idea. There's so many of them. How do you differentiate here? Because I think, uh, or they're all in conjunction, and we're just using um, names for it. Or how do you really look at it?
I look at it the same way you do. There are probably 10 or 12 of these different labels. And essentially, they're all talking about the same thing. It used to be that corporate social responsibility was the watchword of the day. Now, companies don't like that so much. Many companies are using the term ESG, so environmental, social, governance. But you can call it anything. Well, we have a joke in our program: when you can't figure out what to call it, we call it banana. So, you can call it anything you want, but it's about doing well by doing good. There's money in this. There's economic value in creating social value. And if you can incorporate these kinds of strategies into your core business, then you've hit the sweet spot.
And I have to ask you this, Bill, again. We have talked about governments. We have talked about enterprises. What about and individuals as consumers? But where do you think individuals can play a role in this whole idea of good business?
Well, I think individuals have a powerful role to play. Not everybody, of course, wants to get involved in this, but we're all consumers. We're all consumers. And what we want to do is we want to consume products that are economically fair, that are good for us, good for our families, and so forth. There's a lot of research showing that consumers favor products that are doing social good. Now, of course, they're not going to pay top dollar. It has to be economically affordable as well. But once you see that consumers are oriented in this direction, then as a company, you want to appeal to those consumers. You want to get that competitive edge. So just by being smart consumers, we can make a difference.
And but Bill, as we move towards the end of the conversation, I have two more questions to ask. You've had a very interesting body of work over a period of time, from an entrepreneurial journey to being a not-for-profit leader, to creating something very impactful, really working with students as a professor. Uh, what next? Are you the one who's going to create another what do you call, vehicle to go on the moon, or you're looking at something else?
Well, my favorite question is what's next? I love that question, and I believe in renewal, going on to the next thing. So I have three things that I favor right now. And you talked about one of them very early on about what you're doing to create an index for the quality of life for older people. So I'm working on something called CTAC, which I co-founded years ago. This is, you know about this, the Coalition to Transform Advanced Care. So in your country, in our country, across the world, the population is aging very rapidly. And quality of life for these people is very important. So advanced illness, end of life care, this is a critical issue that I'm working on. Another thing is what we were talking about earlier, climate action. And I feel that that's the big one. That's the one that we've got to focus on. So that Medical Society Consortium, I'm beginning work with a fossil fuel company. I think of the idea of climate change as really, really important. And then the third thing for me, Amit, is science and technology. So, it's easy for countries to spend less and less on science and technology. And right now, the US is falling behind. So I'm working with a big organization of pretty notable people to try to convince the Biden administration and the Congress to double the budget, the national budget for science and technology in the next 5 years. And of course, that relates to climate change. These things all work together. So I don't see a rocking chair in my future.
But I think, Bill, I have to disagree with one point here on science and technology. I think you're doing a disservice by just focusing on US. Why don't you focus it across the world? Because we are able to do it across the world. We are able to solve the challenge. Don't you think
Yeah,
just need to expand that? Because I can't disagree with you. Like science in India spends so less on science and technology of the
yeah,
budget.
yeah,
We really
yeah,
need to double it, and that can be transformational.
yeah. Well, I should have said that science and technology, in my mind, in most people's minds, is an international endeavor. We have to learn from each other. We have to share information. I mean, look at COVID-19. The science of dealing with that has to be done, has to be learned, has to be shared on an international basis. The science of climate change, all the different things that go into a better life for all of us, they have to be shared. And science is an international endeavor.
So I think that's a great point. That the world today will have to really create partnerships which are across the board. It has to be
Yeah,
collaborative effort, wherein we are able to bring every country, different businesses, different NGOs, different people together, and really solve the challenges and problems that we face. Otherwise, we're not going to do that. But before we say goodbye on this conversation, Bill, my question is: what are your top three favorite books that
oh,
you would like to suggest to the audience?
oh my. Well, uh, I'll suggest two real quickly. One is the book that really influenced me to start this career. And it's probably out of print. I don't know, but there was an advertising guy named David Ogilvy, and when I was in college, I read his book called "Confessions of an Advertising Man." And what he was basically saying is that marketing and advertising are really exciting professions, highly competitive, highly profitable, and that influenced me to go to Unilever in the first place. And if I were going to write a new book today, I would call it Confessions of a Social Marketer. And that's what good business really is about. And then the second book that I like that I recently read is called The Righteous Mind by a guy, I think his name is Haidt, Jonathan Haidt. And what he argues is in this book, among other things, is that intuition almost always trumps reason. So
Mhm.
if you ask somebody a question, they'll give you an intuitive answer, and then they'll try to come up with a reason to support that intuition. And that's why we have so many problems in our societies. In the United States, we're very divided. red states, blue states. People will give you an intuitive answer, and then they'll try to figure out how to reason it out. We've got to get past that. We really need to get past that. And so I think those are two books that are worth reading. And then, of course, I'm shameless in saying this. I think people ought to read my book.
Of course, that's what they have to do. But I think this has been such a fascinating interaction, Bill, and I think at least one hint, and I will look forward to reading that book called Confessions of a Social Marketeer as soon as it happens. And I hope you do that because uh, I must say towards the end that if there is one person who has had an impact on the world and the world of thinking on social marketing, it has to be Bill Novelli. I think we if you have not seen it or if you have not really read about his work, I think you've missed it. You might have missed his name, but you cannot miss the work that he has actually done. Uh, Bill, it's just been such an honor to have you with us today. And I hope we will find ways to work together again sometime in the near future. I'll share the index with you. But thanks a lot for taking out time, and it's been an honor. Thank you.
Well, thank you for having me. I look forward to working with you too.
Thank you. Bye bye. Be well and be
Bye.
safe.
Thank you.